Pictured here is the French.
Uh-oh.
Pictured here is the French Messagerie Maritime, one of the primary boats which operated at ports in Beirut, Jaffa, and Alexandria, the origin points of all migration to the Americas from the Arab Eastern Mediterranean. The local branch of the Messagerie Maritime in Jerusalem was in fact located centrally at the Jaffa Gate, which is one of the entrances to the old city of Jerusalem today, the heart of Jerusalem. So these are very profitable businesses, and they attracted a lot of very eager young migrants. So migrants from all over Greater Syria, which today includes Jordan, Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, were all Ottoman subjects before 1918. They took several affordable routes westward aboard these ships. One of these routes is pictured here, from Jaffa, Beirut, or Alexandria through France via Marseille, and then to one of several ports across the eastern Atlantic seaboard. This journey took at least 3 weeks. More arduous journeys often lasted longer than a month. The following is an account of a Palestinian from Beit Jala, which is a town in the governorate of Bethlehem, south of Jerusalem, who immigrated to Chile in the 1910s. Well, I'll read it to you and maybe keep this image because I think that the image really says more than alongside the words. It took him 45 days and the trip was anything but easy. We first went to Lebanon to take the boat. We slept the night there. We boarded the boat and it went to Greece. There we took another ship. It was gigantic. It was an Italian ship. The first couple of days we couldn't eat anything. We were all seasick. The first port we came to was Marseille. There we stayed about 5 days, then to Barcelona. After Spain, we arrived to Dakar in Senegal. In Dakar, we stayed one more day, then on to Brazil. The boat stopped in Santos, which is part of Brazilian territory. We slept a night there. Then we went to Rio de Janeiro. From Rio de Janeiro, we continued to Buenos Aires. It took 5 days just from Buenos Aires, excuse me, from Rio de Janeiro to Buenos Aires. That completed the 45-day trip with stops included. But this migrant's journey didn't end at Buenos Aires. He was on his way to Santiago de Chile, which was no small feat either. Migrants arriving in Buenos Aires would link up with Arabic-speaking middlemen who would supply them with credit lines upon arrival at the port of whether Buenos Aires or Rio de Janeiro or Veracruz, Mexico, to cross the continent by train or to enter inland into the American continent. And in the case of Argentina, arriving at Buenos Aires, receiving a credit line, and crossing the continent by train to get to Chile via Mendoza, the Argentinian border town indicated on the map. There's just one problem. They needed to cross the Andes, the spine of South America and the world's longest continental mountain range, stretching from the Caribbean to the Antarctic waters of Patagonia. I took these photos during my trip to Santiago in 2014. This was from the Airbnb where I was staying. Normally, the air pollution in the city obscures the mountains which surround it, but it rained on this day as it was winter in August, and the view was magnificent. But I couldn't help but wonder what were these migrants doing 100 years prior, crossing these massive mountains? What were they thinking? Crossing the Andes Mountains, even in the warmer summer months, is challenging and requires a certain amount of expertise. But the journey, which included a long train ride from Buenos Aires to Mendoza and an even longer ride on mules through the mountains to the nearest train station on the Chilean side, ended with something quite spectacular. What Palestinian migrants found on the other side of the Andes was a landscape and climate that looked and smelled almost exactly like home. The western slopes of the lower Andes bear a striking resemblance to the rolling hills and the drier, temperate climate of Palestine. Pictured here is Illapel in 2014 when I visited. It's a town of around 30,000 residents with a very large number of Palestinians whose ancestors first arrived there in the 1890s, or so they were told. Following an exhausting journey across oceans, continents, and mountains that took weeks, you can see why these pioneering Palestinians chose this little mountain enclave and others like it as a final resting stop. So who were these Palestinian migrants who happened to find Palestine west of the Andes? Largely, they were Christians from the towns of Bethlehem, Bejala, and Bet Sahur, all within the Bethlehem governorate south of Jerusalem, but also from Ramallah, Jerusalem itself, Nazareth, and elsewhere in Palestine. The pattern of migration was more or less as follows. The first to migrate were almost always young men who were fleeing conscription in the Ottoman army. These youth would initially spend a few months or years in the mahjar, or the diaspora, save enough money to return with remittances or money, wealth, back to the homeland, and then bring along parents, siblings, and hopefully a wife to join them on the next voyage westward. Whether they were fleeing conscription, economic crisis, or suppression by the Ottoman authorities due to political activism, thousands of Palestinians boarded ships alongside Syrians, Lebanese, Egyptians, Greeks, Turks, and other migrants from the Mediterranean basin, and headed to the New World. Importantly, these migrants regularly returned to Palestine with bags of money, and a tradition of bi-directional travel that became a mainstay of the Palestinian economy by the time of the British Mandate. And of course, this was a phenomenon witnessed amongst migrant communities across Europe. So sort of the idea of returning to whether Ireland, Italy, Greece, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, by migrants from these lands was central to establishing, or to sort of the burgeoning of modern cities, let's say, and modern sensibilities in many of these cities. An exception to this pattern of migration, one which shows how rich and layered the narratives of these pioneering migrants were, is the story of Katrina Saade, pictured here in the center of the photo. The modest Greek Orthodox Saade family from Bethlehem first migrated to Kiev, today in the Ukraine, in 1906, but at the time it was part of the Russian Empire. Struggling to feed his growing family, Abdullah Saade, Katrina's father, seated right here to her right, was drawn to the Russian Empire due to Tsar Nicholas II's interest in expanding Orthodox commercial networks. So essentially, they sold Holy Land goods like crosses and rosaries and olive wood and so on. So Abdullah, like most Palestinian migrants, sold these Holy Land items in Kiev, and became quite secure financially enough to come and go to Palestine, to Eastern Europe throughout the early 20th century. Katrina, 6 at the time of her family's migration to Kiev, grew up there. But in 1914, with economic calamity across the Russian Empire and with the Bolshevik Revolution brewing, Abdullah fled danger in Kiev and returned to Bethlehem to stay. But that year also saw the Ottomans' entry into World War I against the Allied forces. An already exhausted economy was now under wartime siege, and Abdullah couldn't feed all of his children in Bethlehem. He therefore sent 14-year-old Katrina with her sister and her brother-in-law to Saltillo, Mexico, to marry Jamil Kabandi, also a Palestinian who had settled in Mexico a decade earlier. So Katrina, who by then spoke a combination of broken Arabic and Russian, broken Russian and broken Arabic, was sent halfway across the world to marry a man she did not know in a Spanish-speaking country. She was also 14. Certainly, this was better than hunger in Palestine. Katrina arrived in Saltillo, married Jamil, who actually went by Emilio. He Latinized his name by the time he arrived in Mexico, and began a life as part of the town's growing Palestinian Jalia, or migrant community. Katrina had 2 children with Jamil, but Jamil was killed in a train accident in 1916 during the Mexican Revolution. And one of their children died of the flu that year as well. By 1921, she was widowed at 21 years old. She took her surviving daughter, Julia, and traveled to South San Francisco in California, where her sister and brother-in-law had settled a few years prior. There, Katrina married a second time to a Palestinian from Ramallah, Suleiman Farhat, with whom she had 2 more children, one of whom is pictured here sitting on his father's lap. The remainder of Katrina's story is fascinating. I wrote about it in the Jerusalem Quarterly. It's called Trouble with the In-Laws, if you would like to look it up. The remainder of the story is fascinating. It includes fleeing debt during the US Great Depression, briefly returning to her in-laws in Palestine, a family scandal which drove her to run away from Ramallah and with her children and return to the US by fleeing from through Haifa on a boat bound for the Americas. And finally, she divorced Suleiman in 1936 while she was in San Francisco and he was in Palestine. So this is certainly the first transnational divorce in Palestine. Katrina subsequently lived the rest of her life in the US. But I asked Katrina's granddaughter, Kathy Kenny, who shared with me her grandmother's trove of letters from the 1920s and 30s, how her grandmother identified. She was born in Palestine in 1900 as an Ottoman, but only spent the first 6 years of her life there, and then moved to Kiev, and then Mexico, and then South San Francisco. Did she identify as a Palestinian throughout her later life in California? Did she say she was an Arab? These questions of identity have always fascinated me. Evidently, Kathy told me her grandmother preferred to identify as a Syrian if it came to it, because geographic Greater Syria included Palestine before the region was carved up following World War I. So the legal and political categories which we use today to designate nationalities in our region did not exist in their current form just 1 century ago. Greater Syria included Lebanon and Palestine, yes, but they were its western and southern regions, respectively. They were not nations. This is to say that while the terms were indeed used before the Europeans carved the region into mandates, they were not used to differentiate nationally between the people of Greater Syria. Rather, Palestinian and Lebanese signified geographic, cultural, political, environmental, and linguistic variations among Syrian communities. Fundamentally, they were all first and foremost Syrians and Arabs, though some communities rejected the term Arab on political and racial grounds, and they were all officially, legally Ottoman subjects. As an interesting example of this fluidity and identification in this early periods from the diaspora, in October 1912, an article was published by the Syrian community in the newspaper Al Zaman, which was based in Argentina. The article was titled, "Who Are We and What Are We Called?" And it was reprinted in a Palestinian newspaper, Palestine, in Jaffa, a few days later, and on October 12th. The article described an incident that occurred among the Syrian community in Chile. So everything is interconnected, regarding the community's preferred mode of identification. Evidently, some members of the community insisted to call themselves Ottomans, while others wanted to be called Syrian Ottomans. The editors of the Palestinian newspaper had the following to say to their readers in Palestine: "We see that the right decision was made by the immigrants of the district of Palestine, because they requested to be addressed as Ottomans, no more and no less, and not as Turkish, Syrian, or Palestinian, which separates the hearts rather than unifies them." Of course, this is the time of the rise of Arab nationalism and a concerted attempt amongst the elites, the elite nationalists of the region, to remain somehow connected to the Ottoman identity, or to the Ottoman center, Istanbul. So this not only conveys the layers of the debate of self and group identification in this delicate phase of the region's history, but also just how interconnected these communities already were transnationally by the time the European colonial forces severed Greater Syria following World War I. So residents and migrants from Greater Syria as far away as Argentina and Chile were in contact in 1912, as early as 1912, and they were posing existential questions and sharing them with compatriots back home. Likewise, newspapers in Palestine were promoting this notion of unity inspired by events in the diaspora, especially in light of the increasing migration and expansion of migrant networks across the greater Syrian diaspora, let's say. So while it's important to affirm the historical unity of Greater Syria, there were actually territorial demarcations put in place by the Ottomans. Of course, it was a very sophisticated empire that ruled 400 years. So there were certainly ways in which it organized its territories. Unlike the borders we have today, these borders were porous, and they were mostly used for taxation purposes and for Ottoman census records. which is actually why we're able to ascertain the numbers of migrants from different parts of the empire. So based on Ottoman censuses conducted in the 19th and early 20th century, around 1.8 million people resided in Greater Syria at the turn of the century, so around 1900. Between 1860 and 1920, around 600,000 persons immigrated from the region to both North and South America. As for Ottoman southern Syria, known as Palestine, it consisted of the Sanjaks of, Sanjak is an Ottoman Turkish word, the Sanjaks of Akka, or Acre, and Nablus, within the state, or Vilayet, of Beirut, as well as the autonomous Mutasarrifat of Jerusalem. Jerusalem had its own designation, pictured on the map in the lower sort of orange bit of Palestine that included Gaza. The population of the two Sanjaks and the Mutasarrifat, so the lands between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, which we know today as historic Palestine, was approximately 600,000 in 1900 as well. And migrants from these areas amounted to approximately 10,000 by the start of World War I in 1914, and over 40,000 by 1936. But the arrival of British forces into Jerusalem in December 1917 marked the end of Ottoman rule and the transition into a new age of European mandates. The infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 severed Greater Syria and Iraq to reflect the interests of European forces, leaving us the borders we know today, roughly. In 1921, the League of Nations ratified the British and French mandates, which were meant to be temporary, guiding the peoples of the region to self-determination. This short-sighted mission was muddled by the 1914 Balfour Declaration, through which Britain promised the Zionist Federation of Great Britain and Ireland to see to the establishment in Palestine of a Jewish national home. How they would do this while honoring their promise to the Palestinians and the Arabs, well, we know all too well that they simply did not. The Balfour Declaration featured in the text of the British Mandate for Palestine, which Britain unilaterally issued in 1920 in contravention of international law. Britain's only legal status in Palestine as of its occupation in December 1917, which it was not allowed to change, was as belligerent occupant. Nonetheless, member states of the League of Nations did not challenge Britain's illegal shift to playing an administrative role in Palestine, and Britain went ahead with its plan to thoroughly colonize it. Part of this process included carefully selecting Palestine's population for British purposes. Article 7 of the text of the British Mandate for Palestine stipulated that the government of Palestine shall enact a nationality law through which it would facilitate the naturalization as British Palestinian subjects of the nearly 400,000 Jewish immigrants who would settle Palestine over the course of Britain's 30-year occupation there. The nationality law used to naturalize these settlers, known as the Palestinian Citizenship Order in Council, was promulgated in July 1925. Through it, tens of thousands of Palestinian citizenship certificates were issued, and most to European Jews, such as the one pictured here, issued to Leopold Koff. I'll put the slide up, but I'll also read it to convey just how lopsided British mandate policy was in practice. Between 1925 and 1929, out of a total of 20,168 applications for Palestinian citizenship, 15,551 were approved. Non-Jewish naturalization accounted for only 1% of this total. On March 8, 1937, British colonial authorities reported that more than 28,000 Jews had been naturalized in Palestine between 1931 and 1936. And out of a total of 4,941 certificates of citizenship granted in 1936, 4,847 were for Jews. Meanwhile, by 1937, around 9,000 applications for citizenship had been submitted by Palestinians residing in Latin America. And quote, of these, not more than 100 were accepted. This continued for the duration of Britain's occupation of Palestine until 1948. As for why British authorities regularly denied Palestinian migrants their applications for citizenship, they offered several reasons, which they were very candid about to one another in the sources I found in London. So these are just a few of my favorite. Insufficient proof of, quote, intention to remain permanently in Palestine. unfounded, given that all of the Palestinians in their applications intended to return and indicated addresses and properties and so on. Insufficient proof of connection to Palestine, that, despite birth there, despite language, family, wealth, absence for a period longer than 12 years, which was in fact an arbitrary number. They changed it a few times and decided 12 was sufficient. The migrants' patent undesirability, which it was left to the discretion of the immigration officer to determine. And finally, these migrants cannot be held to have had direct connection with Palestine except under the Ottoman regime, or to have any legitimate claim to be considered Palestinians or to British protection. Therefore, they are not and never have been Palestinians. Meanwhile, Jews entered Palestine virtually without check of any kind, as John Shuckburgh, the head of the Middle East Department of the Colonial Office in London, himself said in May 1925. Of course, British authorities were fully aware of this policy. In fact, as I mentioned, I found all of these stark numbers in not even declassified. These were they weren't public, but these were communiques and memos communicated amongst British officials stored in England's National Archives outside London. They were also fully aware that they were contravening international law. In 1923, just before 2 years prior to the citizenship law, the Allied forces and their defeated Turkish counterparts signed the Treaty of Lausanne, which was officially ratified a year later on August 6, 1924. The treaty delineated the sovereign borders of the new Turkish Republic in exchange for Turkish authorities officially relinquishing all claims to territories they once held in the Arab world. This extended to any claims they held over any residents of the territories, including those residing abroad. As a result, all former Ottoman subjects were stripped of Ottoman nationality and came under the trusteeship of mandate authorities. As for residents of these territories who were residing abroad, Article 34 of the Treaty of Lausanne gave them the right to, quote, opt for the nationality of the territory of which they are natives, if they belong by race to the majority of the population of that territory. This was based on the 3 legal criteria laid out in the treaty itself, qualifying folks for nationality. Nationality through birth on that land, through blood lineage, paternal, or through long-term residence. The treaty therefore officially promulgated Palestinian nationality globally and protected Palestinians' rights to it from wherever they were in the world, whether they had been Ottomans or always identified as Palestinians or Syrians and so on. This is precisely why tens of thousands of Palestinians protested through petitions the denial of their citizenship. They qualified for it through birth and or blood. But this is where the governance of Palestine fell outside of international law. As a territory promised to the Zionists, the League of Nations in Geneva, which was tasked with managing the mandates, left the administration of Palestine entirely to the discretion of the British Crown, as John Quigley and Peterson historians have shown. A crown which had clear interests in following through with its promises to the Zionist organization. International law, including the Treaty of Lausanne, to which Britain was a signatory, therefore did not apply to Palestine. And this, in fact, sets a precedent we see to this day. But when I found these documents in the National Archives in London, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. But what about all those documents Frederick and I found in Jerusalem just a couple of years prior on my research trips? I needed to know how Palestinians in Latin America responded to this injustice, which meant that the missing piece was in Latin America. What I found in the National Library of Chile, the Biblioteca Nacional, in 2014 was unprecedented. In hundreds of newspapers and petitions addressed to Jerusalem, London, Geneva, and many other places, Palestinians and their allies across the Americas, from New York all the way to Santiago, spoke up and objected to Britain's abuse of power, demanding redress. This is also where I locate the shift in self and group identification among Palestinian migrants. While they still identified as Syrians or Arabs, they no longer identified as Turks, or excuse me, as Ottomans. What British Mandate authorities did by denying them Palestinian citizenship was cement the sense among them that they were and would always be Palestinians. On April 13th, 1927, for example, a Palestinian migrant in Trujillo, Honduras, said the following in a petition he addressed to the League of Nations after his application for citizenship, along with several other folks he was speaking on whose behalf he was speaking, were denied. Quote, "We are Palestinians, born, bred, and reared, and no power on earth can sever our claims and rights as Palestinians." I want to give you a sense for the language these Palestinians used in all these petitions. They'd clearly done their homework. They'd read up on the legal jargon, including the Treaty of Lausanne and the 34th Article, and on the relationship between the League of Nations and the mandates under its authority. The petitions were first authored in Arabic or Spanish, but then translated into English upon delivery to the nearest British consular office, whether in Mexico City, Santiago, or elsewhere. I'll read excerpts from one petition, which I find represents all of them. The next few slides I'll go through quite quickly. This was written on February 23rd, 1927. Wow. I realized that was just a couple of weeks ago. By Vice President Abraham Masso and Secretary BJ Qawas of the Centro Social Palestino in Monterrey, Mexico. To His Excellency Field Marshal Lord Plumer, High Commissioner, Government of Palestine, Jerusalem, Palestine. Sir, we undersigned, native-born Palestinians, resident of the cities of Monterrey, Saltillo, Chihuahua, and San Pedro, Republic of Mexico, do hereby and most respectfully solicit your aid in the solution of a problem which for us is most serious. We've always maintained contact with our native land and continue to cultivate ties, those ties of blood, language, tradition, and all other ethnic and social associations which go to make up a native land. We believe we are entitled to consider ourselves as Palestinians. We were born in that territory, have always wished to be Palestinians, and we are sure if as a last resort it shall become necessary to carry our petition before the League of Nations, that august body will grant us the right to consider ourselves nationals of Palestine. We believe, sir, with all due respect, that the decision of the Palestine government as expressed by you does not in any way agree with the spirit of the treaties, nor the clearly manifested intention of the League of Nations to foster, encourage, and revive the small nations which before the war were subject to others. Signed on behalf of the members of the Palestinian colonies by the Centro Social Palestino. Pictured here is the first of 5 pages of over 300 signatures. Note the letterhead, which says the Hijos de Palestina, Sons of Palestine Committee in Saltillo, Mexico. The first line in Arabic, in handwritten Arabic, indicates that this committee collected these signatures and sent them to the Centro Social Palestino in Monterrey, which was a bigger hub, in order to add the names of Palestinians in Saltillo to the Monterrey petition. Palestinians across Mexico's northern corridor were very much connected and very much politically engaged. Over the course of British Mandate rule in the interwar period, more than 3,000 appeals reached, does not mean that they were considered or even opened, but arrived at the desk of the League of Nations. The majority, at 43.3%, concerned Syria, or Palestine more specifically. Palestinians across the Americas also protested British and French mandate policies in newspapers. What I found in the microfilms in the Biblioteca Nacional in Santiago, home today to the largest Palestinian population outside of the Arab world at nearly 500,000, was in fact a treasure trove. The archive houses more than 10 journals and periodicals published by the migrant community. These are just some of the most prolific publications that I found. Apart from the wealth of information I was able to find about the lives of these early Syrian diaspora communities, including Palestinians and Lebanese, of course, and about the many difficulties and successes they faced, these Arabic and Spanish newspapers showed unequivocally that the development of collective Palestinian, Syrian, and Lebanese national consciousness occurred transnationally, not just in the homeland and not just in Palestine. In one newspaper issue after the other, following the installment of the British mandate, of the mandates in general in Greater Syria, Palestinians and their Syrian and Lebanese counterparts called on one another to secure their rights from mandate authorities and to protect Palestine from the Zionist threat. They were also fully aware of the Balfour Declaration and of Britain's duplicitous plan in Palestine. And they were also fully aware that the denial of their citizenship applications was part of this plan. In article after article, newspaper editors warned their readers of the dangers of European imperialism and of the importance of safeguarding the right to Palestinians to their nationality, specifically Palestinians, because the Lebanese and Syrians were not being denied it by French authorities. The Lebanese-Syrian migrants, I mean. In addition to encouraging them to go to British consulate in Santiago and submit applications for citizenship, editors were urging them to join the Committee for the Defense of the National Rights of Palestinians, which formed in Santiago in 1927. In fact, a similar committee was formed, named exactly, well, almost similar. It was named the Committee for the Defense of the Rights of Palestinians Residing in Foreign Countries, was formed that year as well in Bejala, back in Palestine. Members of the committee marched to the offices of the government of Palestine in Jerusalem alongside Musa Kadhim Husseini, who the leader of the Palestinian nationalist movement, to deliver their own petition in defense of the rights of their compatriots in the diaspora. These documents suggest not only that collective Palestinian political consciousness was occurring and developing transnationally, but that for Palestinians, it was inextricably linked to their nationalist movement, as well as to Britain continually denying the rights to that identification and to what it meant legally and physically, of course, and geographically. This identification as Palestinian and with Palestine is quite palpable in Chile to this day. Certainly, I could show you many Googleable photos from today, but I thought I'll just show you the ones that I took myself back in 2014, apart from a couple which I had to Google, such as this one. One of the country's main football or soccer clubs is named the Club Deportivo Palestino. It was formed in 1920 by Palestinian migrants. Chile is also home to large and frequent anti-Israeli occupation marches and demonstrations. Here, I'll show you some of the ones I attended that summer, or that winter, rather, in August. Of course, the ones organized since October 7th, since the genocide, are much larger, but here are just some examples, or some images from those. There's also many examples of the imprint of Palestinians and other Arabic-speaking migrants on the social fabric of Chile itself. Barrio Patronato in central Santiago, plaza named after the Arab migrants. Mercado Vega Central in Santiago, also just a vegetable vendor. Fruits of the country, the Palestinian. This was a photo sent to me by a friend recently in Santiago. Las Condes is a very upscale neighborhood in Santiago. One of its central squares is called Plaza Palestina. One of the most prestigious clubs you could join in Santiago is called the Club Palestino. It's cultural, athletic, sort of any type of exclusive. Imagine like an upscale life and what that club would host. It's found there. Another example of sort of signifying Palestine in the most mundane ways, right? The football field is this way and Palestine is that way. And finally, this was in 2014. So this was during Israel's attack on Gaza at the time that killed over 2,000 Palestinians. So someone had written this on the glass window at the entrance to the Club Palestino. So in conclusion, what are the implications of this historical narrative for our understanding of Palestinian history and for our understanding of the current reality of Palestinians? Well, first off, for historians and folks interested in studying Palestine historically, the study of Palestine and Palestinians in the past does not need to be limited to geographic Palestine or to British and Israeli archives that are largely inaccessible to Palestinians. Our documents, our historical record, are stored in archives and personal collections across the world, and they house stories that need to be told. Secondly, the British mandate for Palestine was designed with fundamental inequities that at no point throughout their occupation of Palestine did they seek to rectify. In fact, the success of the mandate was arguably predicated on these inequities and to maintaining them. Connected to this is the blaring truth that whether 100 years ago or today, Palestine continues to be an exception when it comes to the application of international law. Britain set this precedent in 1917. By the time they left Palestine in 1948, Britain had denied 40,000 Palestinians their legal rights to their nationality enshrined in the Treaty of Lausanne. The subsequent colonizers of Palestine, the Zionists, have simply been continuing a practice of exiling Palestinians and keeping them in exile since they formed their state in 1948. Unlike their British predecessors who got away with it, we know too well that today accountability in international law continues to magically be overlooked when it comes to the Israeli regime's violations, most recently the crime of genocide against the Palestinian people. What I believe this suggests for the ongoing pursuit of justice for Palestinians in colonized Palestine and in exile is that we, alongside our allies, other marginalized and oppressed communities across the world, we must move on from centering our liberation struggle around the rhetoric of rights. It carries little significance against regimes of oppression that daily circumvent international law with impunity. While our allies with the legal expertise and stamina to do so continue to represent or present their cases before the ICJ or the UN General Assembly or any other international legal forums to disrupt the Zionist and US war machines, it strikes me as critical at this moment of increasing global solidarity amongst Palestinians and their allies at the local street level, as well as increasing threat to Palestinianness, for us to realize the extent of the Palestinian diaspora, the extent of our numbers, of our resources, of our experiences, of our capabilities, and to mobilize around them. The irony around this is that the Zionists in Europe and in the late 19th century Europe showed us just how effective that could be at securing rights and getting political goals, achieving political goals. Our ancestors in Monterrey, Saltillo, Santiago, and elsewhere may not have succeeded at securing Palestinian nationality through the legal means that they pursued, neither for themselves nor their children, but they taught us that we should use our numbers and our geographic fragmentation to our advantage. The very fact that our struggle to belong to Palestine from exile began in 1925, not 1948, and that it includes millions of descendants of Palestinians scattered as far away as the Chilean Andes and Mexican desert. Millions who today are unabashedly proud to be Palestinian and devastated like the rest of us with rage and grief over the continued genocide of our people should compel us to forge expansive networks of Palestinians to collectively heal and to then strategize how to safeguard our connections to the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Thank you.
Nadim, thank you so much for that really powerful presentation. We're running a little bit behind time, but I think we are going to extend for a few more minutes, just if that's okay with you, Nadim, for questions. I'm sure that we have questions from folks here, and I want to.
Of course. I'm just going to try to, I'll stop share. There it is.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Magda, please.
So would you know if many Palestinians also went to Colombia, South America? Because we were in the southern part of Colombia on the ocean, and there was an entire area called Turcos. So I think they all took that denomination. Yeah. And the areas where, and of course, there were lots of what we call greater Syrian people living in these areas. Also, most Palestinians, Lebanese, and Syrian are known as Shawam, like Shawam Syrian. They never call them by their denomination until today. even the bread, the pita bread is called Aishen, meaning from this area. So
Wow.
that your explanation explained many of the terms that existed, like in
Wow.
America or in Egypt, because so many of them went to Egypt as well.
Yes. There's a absolutely that there's little data on exact some folks Manzar Furuhar and I'll have to forget the other I'll have to remember the other historian's name have tried to trace the origins of Arab families in many different Latin American contexts. It's not easy, but what we do know is that yes, certainly there were Palestinians in Colombia as well. What we know is that the highest number of Palestinians per capita in Latin America is Honduras. The largest population is Chile. The largest number of Bejala Palestinians is in Peru. So it's really it just depends where your relatives ended up, you followed, or where your neighbors ended up, you followed. And of course, what you mentioned is critical is that most of these migrants, when they arrived at different ports, were registered as Turcos, as Turks, because they were Ottomans. And so this became a derogatory term for that's around to this day. Of course, now it doesn't carry the same weight it did 100 years ago as a racial slur, but it's a derogatory term, and it's obviously incorrect. But yes, there has been, from what I understand, some reappropriation of the term by newer generations, saying, you know, we can use the T word, let's say, and use it, you know, to sort of throw it back as something that we can reclaim in a way. But that's fascinating to hear about shwam, that shwam is used. You mean to this day in Colombia?
No, it was in Egypt, in the Shawam.
Oh yeah, in Egypt, of course. Yes. Aish shami, aish.
The T word was used in Colombia.
All across South America.
Yeah, all across, yeah. So, I also read somewhere that when the greater Syrian people wanted to go to the Americas, the boat will stop first in Latin America, and they say, this is America, yes.
Yeah.
Out the boat,
Yeah.
you live in the area. Is that true?
Yeah, actually, I talk about that a bit in the chapter on Mexico, because it was much easier to enter the Americas through Latin American ports, not through North American, not through US ports, let's say. And then they would often go to Veracruz, and from there go on foot through Texas, through El Paso, and get to the US. Yeah. Sarah Gautieri wrote a beautiful book about this community arriving. I think it's called Arab Paths. Is that correct, Amy? Maybe. Yeah, about the early Syrian immigrants are entering the U.S., many of whom entered through Mexico. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering if you were able to get a sense of any sort of pushback from the governments of these countries like Mexico or Chile, regarding the nationalistic practices or efforts being made by the Palestinian communities.
Could you just the at the end?
Yes, just if there was any pushback because these groups of Palestinians were engaging in nationalistic efforts.
That's really incredible. That's a brilliant question. So yes, there was a crackdown on migrant everything at the time. Not just Syrians of different nationalities, any migrant communities that were misbehaving, right? So there was not any evidence that they were being targeted or threatened by the government for being politically active in this nationalist way, because these were very legal procedures that they were following. They were going and submitting these applications at the consulates. They were not protesting in the streets and so on. But the biggest sort of backlash against the larger Syrian community was in their trades as merchants. Largely, they were merchants. They often did not follow local laws and rules. They worked on the weekends, especially on Sundays, which was not okay in Catholic countries. They lived oftentimes where they worked, just in the back, which was also not something which was also frowned upon, I'm sure, for maybe zoning purposes or taxation purposes. And they often swindled their customers, just trying to sell at a higher rate. So they were known as liars, frauds. They were indecent sometimes when it came to treating some female customers. I read some complaints in the newspapers. Of course, these are the newspapers. I read all of these things in the newspapers, and these are the editors of the newspapers speaking to their own community. So it's the Syrian community speaking to itself. So they're reprimanding the community for embarrassing the community. And in fact, there were crackdowns on numbers of migrants being allowed in, both in Mexico and Chile, the two contexts I studied. Also to put a cap on the numbers entering. And interestingly, just how racialized immigration policy was even at that time. Or especially at that time, let's say, because these are the first waves of migration to these parts of the Americas. The biggest issue was that they wanted more white-blooded immigrants than, let's say, non-white-blooded immigrants. So what these newspaper editors would say to their community was, act more like the Europeans. We don't want to be confused or lumped with the Africans or the Asians. Be more Anglo, be more Saxon, worthy, sort of behave, act more white, so that they don't cap our numbers, and so that they don't try to send more of us back. Because yes, many of them did overstay their visas, or many of them did not renew the residency, or at the time it was much easier to do that than these days. So there was a crackdown on finding these folks and trying to send them back in the 20s, especially the period I was reading. But in terms of this political activism itself, no, because ultimately, as I said, it wasn't causing a scene in these Latin American cities, and also because Britain didn't need to respond to them. And the Britain didn't even sound the alarm about them. It was just a negligible sort of, what's a petition? We don't need to do anything, even if they protest. So yeah, unfortunately, that's all I know about in terms of cracking down on this particular political activism, that there wasn't any, because it didn't work.
Yeah, okay. Okay, great. We have a question.
Why is it that even though they arrived in the port of Buenos Aires, the majority of the population still traveled on to Chile?
In Bolivia also.
Why did they continue on to Chile if they arrived at Buenos Aires?
Yeah, like why is there not a larger population of Palestinians in Buenos Aires or Argentina?
Yeah, these are amazing questions. Thank you. It's because they were already oversaturated markets with migrants, especially Lebanese and Syrians. So the Lebanese were the first to set sail, obviously from Beirut being the largest port historically in the region, and the Lebanese being expert traders and merchants were the first to set sail. And the Lebanese migrant communities expanded so quickly and successfully that by the time Syrians and Palestinians started arriving, they didn't want to compete with them. So they went to less, let's say, saturated markets. That's what we know in terms of Cecilia Baeza is the first to sort of find this information about these first settlers, these first Palestinian settlers. There is some evidence that some Palestinians had the option. They could have stayed in Buenos Aires, but they preferred. There's some anecdotes about this that I write in the book that I found in the newspapers, but they preferred Chile because it's quieter. It reminds them of home, the landscape, the climate, the weather, the conservatism, actually, as well, the sort of the traditionalism, let's say. social conservatism and traditionalism relative to bigger port cities like Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro. Also, the language was much easier in this is comparing Brazil to other to Spanish speaking countries. So we don't find a big community of Syrians or Palestinians in Brazil. It's mostly Lebanese. For this reason, linguistically, it just was much more. Spanish was much more accessible as it is today for most folks than Portuguese, and also because Spanish was closer to French or Italian, which they would have known as Christians coming from the Holy Land. So the main reason is economic. They didn't want to compete with one another. And there was a sense of unity. If my Syrian Lebanese neighbor who does the same thing I do trade-wise has this area covered, I'm gonna go find somewhere else, basically.
I'm going to exert my power as moderator to ask the final question, because I love the presentation so much, and I've just been inspired by the questions here. But I'm actually curious about two things. The first is a lot of these immigrants are from Bethlehem,
Yes.
correct? And so I'm curious if they translate that in Christian terms when they arrive to Latin America of like a common, I'm from the Holy Land, I'm like OG.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And then relatedly, I was doing research on Palestinians in El Salvador, and in the archives in the 30s, there is this like immigrant scare,
Yeah.
where they're required to register themselves, and they have to say whether they speak Spanish and who their like Salvadoran essentially the recommenders are for like their character references essentially, and they're
Oh,
required
wow.
every single year. So it gets pretty racist up in there. So
Yeah.
I'm curious if you see that happening in this context in Chile and in Mexico.
Mexico, yes, absolutely. But I didn't find these sources. It was Teresa, the hyphenated last name, excuse me, Velkamp, Teresa Velkamp, let's say. So close to God, so far from Allah, something like I could Google the title, but this book was so important for me to understand how these early communities settled in Mexico. Mexico, because it was the entry point to the US for many of these migrants, and because it received so many folks who just bypassed any laws they could just to get in and stay. And of course, the northern Mexican frontier is expansive and huge, so it's quite easy to to stay under the radar. There were a lot of attempts by immigration authorities and government authorities to track them down, to hunt them down, and send them back. And Teresa finds a lot of evidence of this, of folks telling each other, how to essentially how to lie when they get caught, or how to not be identified as an Arab, right? Because many of us look the same as Latin Americans, right? So how to come off as more local. Or native, or whatever native is in this context, right? Speak how to pronounce Spanish better, how to compose yourself, how to dress. The other issue in the tumultuous revolutionary years across Latin American contexts is that many of these Syrian migrant communities, larger Syrian, greater Syrian, stayed out of these politics, so they didn't take sides, whether with the loyalists or the revolutionaries, which was convenient at wartime, but did not bode well for them afterwards, especially in contexts where the revolutionaries won, because they were seen as traitors. So they really had to sort of play local politics very carefully. In Chile, I did not see this as much because the immigration numbers were so much lower. Just simply put. Also because not all the Palestinians in Chile settled in Santiago, which would have been the hub of this kind of crackdown, right? Or this kind of registration bureaucracy, or you know what I mean? So many of them did stay in towns like Iapel and Ovalle and Concepcion and these other much smaller towns where authorities were not as interested in pursuing these things. So yeah, Chile was kind of like that final frontier and Palestinians managed to get away with a lot, I guess. And back to the question of how they marketed themselves as Christians, absolutely. We are the OG Christians. In fact, they still say that. I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. My family is Christian as well, and my father's from Bethlehem. My mom's from Jerusalem and Ramallah. So when I arrived in Chile and they found out, they saw me drinking, they saw me eating pork. I don't know. I don't show my religion walking around, but it just came up somehow, and they thought, oh, there are more. We thought we were the last ones. I said, what do you mean? They said, we thought that all the Christians have left. I said, well, a lot of them have, yes, but no, some of us still exist. And they said, oh, don't you feel like we have to sort of save the community, and we have to carry Jesus. We are the last remnants of Jesus. I said, well, not sure I agree, but I hear you. I get it. I mean, being so far removed from the motherland, the homeland, and carrying this, I would call it a burden of being a minority within a minority, right? You're not only Palestinian, but you're a Christian Palestinian. And even if you're not religious, you have to wear it somehow and protect it and show that you exist. Certainly these days when, mainstream media try to lump it as a Muslim phenomenon, or like, anyway, Islamophobia, let's just say. But yeah, absolutely. When they first arrived 100 years ago, they walked around with rosaries and crosses and olive wood, and even if you go to the Holy Land now, even here in Jordan, some parts of Jordan, they will sell you in little vials, in little glass vials, dirt and water, and tell you it's holy dirt and holy water. I'm sure it's tap water. I'm sure it's dirt from the street, right? But arriving to the Americas 150 years ago with dirt from the Holy Land, even if it wasn't blessed by a priest, is holy, right? That's as holy as it gets. So, I mean, this became extremely marketable in very Catholic countries. And what's really interesting is that the majority of Christian groups and Christian communities are Greek Orthodox here. They were very okay with acting Catholic when they got to the Americas. They had no problem. And many Muslims as well, so it was just a market that they were the right time, right place. It was affordable to travel. It was not easy, but nothing was, right? World War I, Ottomans against the British, or 3-week journey to a land of potential promise. Let's take that 3 weeks, right? So yeah, it's just a fascinating period.
Thank you so much, Nadim. I just want one more round of applause for you.
I'm sorry that the talk went over. I actually ended up adding much more than I had written, so I'm sorry that I kept going tangentially.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
For doing such a magnificent work.
Thank you. Gracias. I appreciate it.
Yes, no. That's it. Yep. Okay. Excelente manera de venir. Yeah. So